Words are bridges.
शब्द सेतु हैं।
अल्फाज दिलों को और इंसानियत को जोड़ने का एक अजीम और तरीन पुल है।
വാക്കുകൾ പാലങ്ങളാണ്.
लफ्ज़ सरी कदल तारान
आखर हमार मेल सन आखर हमार जोड़
শব্দই সমন্বয়ৰ হেতু
Cocktail rock, yakraise.
Thuhi inkung kaina siam tu ani.
Ajrahana apati kisale.
Grauthaining yaukrai.
Shabda setu hon.
शब्दां दी सांस।
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of our festival co-directors, Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, and our festival producer, Sanjoy K. Roy, I welcome you back for another episode of Jaipur Literature Festival's Words Are Bridges. Our session today is Scaling the Walls. Uday Prakash, Robert Hueckstedt, and Jason Grunebaum in conversation. Writer and independent filmmaker Uday Prakash has been described as one of India's most original and audacious writers. A major voice in contemporary Hindi literature, his themes focus on the human and political contradictions of modern India. Academic Robert Hueckstedt has translated Prakash's short stories into English as Rage, Revelry, and Romance, and Short Shorts, Long Shots. Writer and translator Jason Grunebaum has translated much of Prakash's work into English, including The Girl with the Golden Parasol and The Walls of Delhi. Together, they discuss Prakash's writing journey and his unique style of storytelling that is an amalgamation of wry humor, darkness, and displacement. Uday Prakash is one of the very few Indian language writers who's been widely translated into all vernacular and all major foreign languages. Most of his short stories have been adopted for the stage and films. He's also received several awards for his collection of short stories, Mohandas. Jason Grunebaum is a writer and Hindi translator, whose books include Uday Prakash's The Girl with the Golden Parasol, The Walls of Delhi, and Manzoor Ehtisham's The Tale of the Missing Man. He's been awarded the Global Humanities Translation Prize and NEA Literature Fellowship and a Penheim Grant. Robert Hueckstedt is professor at the Department of Middle Eastern and South Asian Languages and Cultures in Charlottesville. His main interests are Sanskrit literature, poetics, the Paninian tradition, and philosophy. From the world of Sanskrit literature and thought, he has stepped into the world of contemporary Hindi literature and has particularly enjoyed indulging in Urdu literature on occasions. His current work includes a selection and translations of short stories by the Hindi writer Mudra Rakshas and a translation of the Harsh Charitra of Bana for the Murti Classical Library of India. Before we move on to our next session, we request you all to please follow our handles on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In case any of you drop off due to bandwidth issues, you can find us on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest JLF, and our Facebook page, JLF Litfest. Please do share your feedback and comments in the comment section below. We now present Scaling the Walls. Uday Prakash, Robert Hueckstedt, and Jason Grunebaum in conversation.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. And thank you very much to the Jaipur Literature Festival and to the whole team that's set up this lovely Words as Bridges segment on literature and translation. I'm Jason Grunebaum. I'm a writer and translator. And there have already been introductions done, so I think that we'll just jump into it with Udayji and Bob. Bob and Uday, I think that, translators and authors working together today are, in a sense, we're very spoiled. If we have any questions for the author, we can send a message via WhatsApp, or we can call, or we can email. But what's interesting to me is talking to the two of you over the years, that the two of you began working not only before the internet, but at a time when communication between India and the US was the polar opposite of automatic and immediate. So I think that everyone would really benefit from hearing about how the two of you met and then how your working relationship developed in the days when C-mail was pretty much the quickest way to communicate. So I'll throw it out to the two of you to maybe talk about that a bit.
You're asking me? Asking Bob?
Maybe if you could start, Uday, by talking about how you first met Bob and how you first became aware of this wonderful human being, Bob Hueckstedt.
So I tell you, I was working in the Times of India's news weekly Dinman, Hindi news weekly Dinman, and I was in a very the lowest staff in a way, in editorial. I was sub-editor there, and it was, I think, remember exactly 1988-89. So the guard, the peon, he came and he said, "Ek Angrez aapse milne aaya." So I said, no, he would have come over here to see the editor. He said, nahi, wo aapka naam le raha hai. Then I was, it was the strain of some Angrez I to just see a sub-editor. So I asked him, okay, let him come. And then Bob came, and that was the first time I saw him. And he was so tall, I think 6 feet and 6 foot and something, few inches more, very tall. And he was.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but this is something that you can't see on the Zoom screen how tall of a human being Bob Hueckstedt is. He's as tall as his last name is long. I mean, he's an incredibly tall, lanky guy. And if he wasn't a Hindi professor and Sanskrit scholar and translator, he might have been a basketball player in a different life.
And he was wearing this from Gandhi, from Gramodyog, the extra large kurta and pajama. It was too short for him. And he looked so strange. And then he came. And within 15-20 minutes, we knew that we are friends. And he came to ask me to translate Tirish. And you can imagine, I mean, the Tirish was the first short story of mine, which was translated by a wonderful friend of mine, and is Bob. And then I took him one day to honor lunch with him and Kareem. And when we had to pay the bills, I found that I don't have that much money. So Bob started laughing and he paid for the lunch. And Bob, that time he said, I am not a very rich American. People think over here that every American is a very rich person. He said, I am still using black and white television sometimes. And Bob, then he shifted to my place, my home, my house. It was a very small one room apartment, lower income group house. And we never felt that and can you imagine, I love him a lot. And the way he translated, you both are the translators as a friend, you can find out what is the difference, because after all, Bob is a scholar. He's more interested now in, as he's aging, he's shifting towards Sanskrit and those kind of scholastic works. And
so it sounds like it was very much love at first sight between the two of you, and I can confirm that having known you for so many years. But I'm curious, that first time that you met, did you immediately start rolling up your khadi sleeves, so to speak, and start translating right there and then together? Is this something that you worked on, Bob, later on your own and then consulted Uday about? How did the working relationship begin between the two of you?
No, it was like ask Bob. Because, it was pre-internet ages, pre-computer ages. There was no computer at all. And Bob was so hardworking. He was translating not one story, short stories, several short stories. There are 2-3 books translated by him. And he used all the queries he used to send in by the ship. And it took around 2 months to reach to me. Then I used to answer every query, clarification and all. Then I again send him by ship. And translation was something very physical, very time taking. And it was there on paper. I still have, a lot of bundles of Bob. And the queries he asked, it was, this is translation is a job when you are translating two different cultures and also two different lives. And in India, it's just very variance. It has a lot of variance. And my language, Hindi, is really different than what you find over here in the North India.
So Bob, I'm sorry. I just want to kind of hear your side of the story as well in terms of when you first met. Did you start translating together, in Uday's place? Was it something that you started when you went back home to the States? Maybe you could talk a little bit about how that process, working relationship began from your side.
Yeah, from my side, it was, I never did any translating while I was in India. My approach in those days was, as I wanted to be speaking and thinking in Hindi as much as possible. In fact, I wrote a little bit in Hindi, some really stupid little things, but it was a lot of fun. So no, I did not start the translation of Tidich until I got back to the States. The other thing I would like to add to how Uday and I first met, and what we did at first. And I don't remember really the actual source of all of this and how this got going. But for some reason, I was in Rajan Yadav's office, the Hunt's office, right? And of course, in those days, he was the editor of Hunt's. And he was the one who said to me, because they had just published Tidich in Hunt's. And it had, won a prize or got second for a prize or something like that. And he said to me, you should meet Uday Prakash. He's a great writer, right? He's a good up and coming young writer, right? So I said, okay, sure. Yeah. Where is he? And so it was because of Rajan Yadav that I went over to the offices of Dinman and met Uday Prakash for the first time. One other thing that I remember, Uday, I don't know if you remember this or not, but I was desperate in those days to try to learn as much as I could, not just about individual writers, but I wanted to know what the writers of in that day, and starting with Uday, I would ask every writer I met, give me a list of your, say, top 10, Hindi authors and works. And so Uday sat down and, gave me about 20, right? And so that's how that all became sort of my background reading list, things I would make sure I bought and to take back with me to the States. And so that's how that got started.
Yes,
that's wonderful. Thank you. That's a great story. And I mean, I think we could take this conversation in a lot of different directions, particularly talking about the importance of Rajendra Yadav and the magazine Hans, which also later published Pili Chatriwali Larki in serial form, which sort of brought me into the story. But backing up a little bit, maybe if you could also just, let's move down to the language, to the level of language for a minute. Talk about some of the things that first struck you about Uday as a writer, both in Hindi and then some of the challenges that you had and have had. And translators always talk about challenges, but it would be negligent of us not to talk about the commensurate joys as well, because challenges always sounds like such a burden. So maybe you could talk about a few things. Love at first sight in person, but also love at first sight on the page as well, Bob.
Yeah, well, once I read Tidich, because when I first met Uday Prakash, I had not read Tidich yet, right? But of course, that became one of the first things I did, maybe even later that day when I got back to wherever I was staying. But once I read Tidich, I said to myself, and I would do this with anything I was reading in Hindi those days. Number one, is this something that really resonates with me? Whether or not I think it's good, right? I have to tell that to many authors. I would say, well, look, I like your work very much, but for some reason it just doesn't resonate with me. I just don't hear a translation as I'm reading the English. Right? But with Uday Prakash, my goodness, it was running through my head almost from the very beginning, and so. And of course, then the more he wrote and the more I read, I've said this to many people. He's a writer who just, and it's just congenitally impossible for him to write a bad story, right? Now I know that also in those days, Uday made a big deal on him, and I don't know, Udayji, if you've changed or not about this, but he always said to, like, I'm a poet first. I write short stories because, I like to do that, but I'm a poet first, right? And that's great too. I still think for a prose writer, that's a great attitude to have, because you want your prose to sound as poetic, I think, as the context requires. Now, when it came to, and Jason, you and I have talked a little bit about this too. When I first started translating, of course, I was consciously trying to build a bridge. I mean, I was thinking of that terminology, and the bridge, of course, was, okay, I will take very good contemporary Hindi literature, make good translations of it, get it published in the United States, and make that bridge to show. And I was particularly thinking of writers, right, and poets in the U.S., who would I would hope to maybe get inspired and about the literature that exists in Hindi. Well, so at first, translators talk about domesticating and foreignizing, right? If you're domesticating, you're trying to make the language the language you're writing your translation in sound as much like that, right, as possible. If you're foreignizing, you're trying to push the reader of the translation more towards the original culture, right? I started out as a domesticator. I was thinking of phrases and whatnot that were right out of American lingo, and that's what I was going with at first. Then when I realized that, except for a few poems and a few short stories and a few small literary magazines in the U.S., I was not getting anything published in the U.S. And at the book level, the only publishers that would ever even look at what I had, right, and I didn't have an agent or anything, were publishers in India, right? So then I realized, oh, I'm really writing for an Indian audience. I'm hardly writing for an American audience, right? And that helped push me in a direction that I think it was good for me to go in the first place, and that was to be more of a foreignizer, right? To challenge the reader to go more towards the culture of the original language. And of course, when you're thinking of an Indian audience for a Hindi book, right, that you're translating into English, well, that's pretty easy, because that Indian reading audience in India knows the culture to a large extent. So that's kind of how all that happened.
That's great. There are a lot of follow-up questions that I have about, and it's when you're telling this story, I'm also thinking to myself, I mean, both of you have always been very much ahead of your time, but especially when you're telling the story about trying to find a home for some of these for your translations, back in the day when U.S. publishing culture was even less receptive, even more
yes.
Averse to translations. I think that we can pretty safely say that it's a lot better than it used to be, even though we have a long way to go on so many fronts. And part of my heart breaks a little bit, hearing you tell some of those stories, just thinking, boy, all of the, there would just be so many more options. There would be so many more really happy and receptive homes for a lot of the work that you've done for Indian audiences. When you first saw Bob's translations, how did you feel? And also, did you see your own work differently because of the first translations in English or into other languages? Did it sort of shed a new light on your work and maybe change any of your process in any way? I'd be curious to hear from your side as the author.
I tell you, I was not, as you know, I am not very confident in Hindi. I am not very confident in English, and I was not educated in any convent or public school. So I was learning English on my own, but I took a lot of time to read, and the Teris was already translated by one Indian translator, Jay Ratanji, and I had that translation with, like Mohandas. It has 3 or 4 translations in English, but I am very keen reading English, and then I read Bob, and I found it quite different. The idiom and everything, the way he wrote, and I liked it. I liked it very much. And when he started, like he said, that originally I'm a poet, I repeated again, I'm really a poet. And he was the first in English to translate my poem in Poem Hunter. And he translated 10 of my poems. And I liked those translations. And recently, I think Orte, the women, which has been recited by Irfan, now no more. Sorry. So he has recited, the poem was translated by Bob. So I know Bob is someone, he like, on the one hand, he translates Mudra Rakshas, and he loves Mudra Rakshas, because I remember when he came first time to see me, he also went to Lucknow and met Mudra Rakshas. And when he came back, he had already translated him, his Dandavidhan, into English. So he came, and the way he told, he was shaken. He said that the Mudra Rakshas is facing a lot of trouble, and he was more interested in Mudra Rakshas' life, and he was talking a lot, and I still remember in '89, I think, when he came, we went to see a play, a rehearsal that was being rehearsed by Sardar Hashmi.
Yeah.
And that was a play based on Premchand's short story, Mote Ram Ka Satyagraha. And it was a big satire, it's a kind of a biting comment on one creamy, well-fed, elite intellectual is now following, it's trying to emulate Gandhi. So he's fasting. So, and Bob with me, he went to see the rehearsal, and he met Sardar and Mala. Those were the young days, And Bob was the first person to write, when he was in America, to write about Sardar. And that was, I think, it was Washington Post. I don't know. He will be telling you. And there was some mistake, because the newspaper, it had said that Sardar Hashmi was the founder of CPI. So Bob sent me a letter. I'm sending you the clip. But the Americans, they hardly know about the Indian history and political situation and all that. So those were the times, it was very difficult to have any kind of these kind of frequent conversations or online discussions like now we have with Zoom, before we had with WhatsApp and before through emails. So I think this technology also in a way helps the author, the two individuals of different languages or different countries or different zones, to get a little closer. But when you came, we hardly had this kind of apps like Skype and all. I remember when you came, I didn't know who are you. But when you arrived at the airport, I tell you, I simply knew that he is Jason. And I saw you. I mean, you were so So, what should I say? You had a camera, and everywhere, whenever you saw a butterfly, a yellow color, you just simply started taking shots. So it really it touches an author, because I think the relationship is not about some academic relation that some institution is funding and someone is translating. It's not that. And I'm very fortunate. I'm blessed in a way because sometimes I really am not that way rational, and you know it very well.
I'm glad you brought up the first time we met Uday, because I'll never forget that either. I mean, we had been corresponding by email for some time. We had been discussing the translation of The Girl with the Golden Parasol, and then it was 2004, 2005. And when you had just published Mohandas, the story about the about the low caste guy from the village who has his identity stolen by a Brahmin. And when I landed at the airport, our drive back to your place took longer. We weren't detained because the traffic was so bad. What took us so long was you had to pull over every 5 minutes because you were getting SMS after SMS from your legion of fans in the Hindi heartland saying, "Man, Mohandas, I am Mohandas." I mean, so many people identified with your character, and Hindi authors, publish their mobile numbers and their home addresses in their books. So when we arrived home, you had a stack of, 1 rupee postcards waiting for you as well from your legion of fans across India, talking about how much your story had meant to them. And that was just something so wonderful and so kind of unimaginable. This connection that you had with your readers, for somebody coming from the U.S., where there's quite often much more of a distance. Before we get to, I know we want to get to do a little bit of a reading here, but I just want to ask Bob a question about this question of your journey from going from kind of a domesticator, as you said, trying to translate for more of a North American audience, and then realizing that at the time there really wasn't a market for that sort of translation or literature here, or publishers weren't receptive and you couldn't sort of get it in, so you decided to of course the largest market for translated Hindi literature will always be India and the subcontinent. I've thought about these issues a lot too, and it's a very interesting question for me. I've also gone, I would say, closer to, hey, let the reader, do a little bit more work. And I think it's easier to ask the reader to do that now for various reasons. But my question for you, what does it mean to foreignize a translation of a work of Hindi literature for an Indian audience? And do you think that that's, foreignizing is different for an Indian audience versus a non-Indian audience?
Yeah, and I wish I could come up with a good example right off the top of my head, but I can't think of one right now. But so almost sort of more theoretical in a way. One thing I'm sure I would have to do, and I'm translating a major Sanskrit work now too, and I have to do this a lot, and that is either in an introduction or somehow in the translation, and hopefully avoiding footnotes of any kind. There's just some cultural background often, right, that is assumed, right, by the original author, that the translator knows that the target audience is not going to know, right, and then when that cultural background isn't there, then the whole communication, sort of that happens through the poem or the short story or the novel or the play just doesn't happen. So how does one work that work that basic cultural knowledge into the translation without over translating, right? So anyway, so what happens then when you're really doing more of a foreignizing translation than a domesticating one is you just translate the words and ideas and sentences that are there, and let the cultural background stay in the background, and people will get it or they won't.
Yeah. You know, something that I've not struggled with, but it's always, I always find myself in my later drafts now more than ever kind of pruning more of that scaffolding away, you know, pruning as much as possible, really giving just enough information for the reader who might not know about any sort of very necessary cultural information without why don't we move on now to a little bit of reading, because I want to get to sort of the reason why we're all here. And what we had thought was that Uday would read an excerpt from his novella or long short story, depending on who you ask, Dili Ki Diwar, a wonderful story about a street sweeper who finds a cache of black money behind a gym wall and uses it, and all sorts of lovely things happen. But you know, when Bob was earlier talking about how Uday is constitutionally incapable, I don't know why the word unconstitutional is in my head at the moment, but constitutionally incapable of writing a bad story. You know, we've all talked about, we've all looked at his unbelievably natural storytelling gifts, and let's say his trademark is kind of authorial interludes, or you know, intrusion sounds too violent of a word, but into the story. Uday is always very present in his stories, and it's wonderful. And so the excerpt we'd like to read is sort of one of these authorial meditations within the story. So do you have the text ready there, Uday, from I guess Agar aap Dili mein hain?
Yes, I have.
Great. So why don't you read that excerpt first in Hindi, and then I'll read it in English, and then we'll take things from there.
So before this, reading the text, I would like to just say one thing more about Bob and about me. It was the first ever time an invitation to come abroad, I mean to Canada. And that was in Manitoba University, where Bob was teaching. The first ever invitation I received, that was from abroad. That was by Bob. And he tried to organize through ICCR to like Mallika Sarabhai and me. And he wanted us to be together in Manitoba University. But I was so inconfident, and even today, you see me, you can understand. He asked me to just go to the ICCR and meet some, I don't remember his name, and everything is done and you have to be there. Just, and I didn't go there. I was so scared of, going to ICCR and meeting some bureaucrat and then having, buying a ticket for the aeroplane and all. So you can imagine how was me in 1990s, just 90s. And the confidence I have gained just because of those translators who kept on inviting me. The second invitation I got, that was by N. Wanderhoe in Netherlands. And that was a Poetry International Festival. So you can imagine. So to me, translators really, I mean, they translate you without knowing you. And something happens to the, it just is kind of astonishing things happen to the original author. And then he comes closer to a cultural zone where his translator is living in. So anyway, I'm so grateful, and I'm going to read this part, which we had already selected. It's from Delhi Ki Diwar. You have translated Walls of Delhi, which was, I think, 3 times in almost the finalist in several international awards. And then one, of course, just by one vote of the chairperson of the jury, it failed to receive the award. So an author has to suffer all along, you know. So I read it. अगर आप दिल्ली में हैं और कोई ऐसा जीवन जी रहे हैं जिसमें अक्सर रात भर नींद नहीं आती और आप अचानक 3 या 4 बजे उठकर सड़कों पर यूं ही भटकने लगते हैं, तो आपने कभी न कभी किंग्सवे कैंप से राजघाट की ओर जाने वाली सड़क का दृश्य जरूर देखा होगा। किंग्सवे कैंप का नाम बदलकर विजयनगर कर दिया गया है। अगर आप विजयनगर चौराहे से अंदर की ओर निरंकारी कॉलोनी या मुखर्जी नगर जाने वाली सड़क पर चलें, तो धीरे धीरे से उजाड़ सी जगह तक पहुंच जाएंगे जिसे कोरोनेशन पार्क के नाम से जाना जाता है। हालांकि अब उसे एक खूबसूरत बड़े से पार्क में बदल दिया गया है, लेकिन यही वह जगह है जिसके आधार पर यह इलाका किंग्सवे कैंप के नाम से जाना जाता है। कहते हैं कि अंग्रेजों के जमाने में जब जॉर्ज पंचम या चार्ल्स, पता नहीं दोनों में से कौन, हिंदुस्तान आए थे, तो यहाँ के देशी रियासतों के राजा रजवाड़ों के कैंप इसी जगह पर लगे थे। वे विलायत के अपने सम्राट का स्वागत करने यहाँ इकट्ठा हुए थे। कहते हैं कि वह स्वागत कुछ कुछ वैसा ही था जैसा भी कुछ साल पहले अमेरिका के प्रेसिडेंट बिल क्लिंटन का स्वागत था। इसी जगह पर देशी रियासतों के राजा रजवाड़ों के ने अपने अंग्रेज सम्राट का राज्याभिषेक किया था, जिसे अंग्रेजी में कोरोनेशन कहते हैं। और विलायती सम्राट ने यहाँ जो भाषण दिया था, उनके जाने के बाद उसे राष्ट्रीय अभिलेखागार में रख दिया गया था। भाषण की उस प्रति को हिंदुस्तान के इतिहास का एक अहम दस्तावेज माना जाता है। इसके अलावा सम्राट की एक मूर्ति इंडिया गेट के बीचों बीच एक खूबसूरत छतरी के नीचे खड़ी कर दी गई थी। बाद में जब 1947 में अंग्रेज इंग्लैंड लौट गए, तो वह मूर्ति अंग्रेज हुक्मरानों की दूसरी तमाम मूर्तियों के साथ इसी किंग्सवे कैंप के कोरोनेशन पार्क में रख दी गई। आजादी के बाद के सालों में यह पार्क धीरे धीरे भिखमंगों, पागलों, कोड़ियों, लूले लंगड़ों, नशेड़ियों और लावारिस अनागरिक मनुष्यों की आवारा आबादी का अड्डा बन गया। चूल्हा, चक्की, घन, हथौड़ा, सिलबट्टा और पता नहीं किन किन जरूरतों को पूरा करने के लिए इन लोगों ने सम्राट समेत सारे अंग्रेज हुक्मरानों की मूर्तियों के अंग भंग कर डाले। कोई सम्राट का सिर तोड़कर ले गया, कोई हाथ, कोई पैर। बाकी मूर्तियां भी अब सिर्फ डरावने धड़ों के रूप में यहाँ वहां जमीन पर बेतरतीब उगी जंगली घास और झाड़ियों के बीच बिखरी पड़ी थी। रात घिरते ही समूची दिल्ली के कोने कोने से ऐसे लोगों की आबादी इस पार्क में सिमट आती और जगह जगह बिखरी इन्हीं खंडित मूर्तियों के बीच सोकर रात गुजारती। तो जैसा मैंने कहा, अगर आप दिल्ली में हैं और एक ऐसी जिंदगी जीते हैं जिसमें अक्सर आशंकाओं की कोई अंतहीन डरावनी फिल्म सारी रात आपके दिमाग के भीतर चलती रहती है, और किसी बेचैनी और बदहवासी में घिरकर आधी रात या बिल्कुल तड़के आप यहाँ की सड़कों पर बेमकसद भटकते हैं, तो आपने किंग्सवे कैंप के कोरोनेशन पार्क से निकलकर धीरे धीरे माल रोड या राजघाट की ओर रेंगते मनुष्यों के उस अपार झुंड को जरूर देखा होगा। रात का अंधेरा अभी पूरी तरह मिटा नहीं होता। सुबह का कोहरा दृश्य में एक धुंधला रहस्य भरता रहता है, और आप देखते हैं कि फेलेनी या अंतोनियोनी किसी फिल्म के सुरलिस्ट शॉट की तरह टूटे फूटे, विकलांग, अपाहिज, क्षत विक्षत, आधे अधूरे मनुष्यों का विशाल झुंड राजधानी की ओर चुपचाप बढ़ रहा है। लगता है पिछली सदी के किसी महायुद्ध में किसी शहर पर हुई भयावह बमबारी के बाद जीवित बचे घायल और विकलांग लोगों की आबादी उस संहार के मलबे से निकलकर किसी सुरक्षित जीवन की शरण की ओर बढ़ रही है, किसी अंतिम अरण्य की ओर।
So let me quickly read from the English of the first paragraph of what Uday read from The Walls of Delhi. If you're in Delhi and you're the kind of person who doesn't sleep very well at night, and at 3 or 4 in the morning, you're up and you have to leave the house to go wandering around, then you've surely seen the road that goes from Rajghat, from Kingsway Camp, now called Vijayanagar. If you head towards near Gardi Colony or Mukherjee Nagar from the crossing at Vijayanagar, you'll find yourself in a desolate place that's known as Coronation Park. Even though they've turned the place into a big, beautiful park, it's the spot that gave the area the name of Kingsway Camp. So I just want to wrap things up very quickly here. And I want to ask both of you very quickly, what's your, I know, Bob, you mentioned you're working on a Sanskrit translation right now. Maybe you could say a couple words about that. And Uday, if you could just talk about what you're working on right now.
I can be real quick. I'll do it first, Udayji, and then for many years I've been working on a translation of the Harsha Charita by Bana. This was translated last in English in 1897, and it's time for a better translation. Udayji.
I'm just working on 2, 3, 4 things. But recently I wrote a short story, and that was about Corona, this COVID-19, and I sent you both. And yes. And you know, India today doesn't publish any kind of a short story in regular issues. So I'm fortunate that they had published this as a comment on a serious fictional comment on this serious crisis. So Bob liked it, I think. He liked it. But that is the one thing I did. Then I'm working on a novel which has been really pending since long. But now there are 2, 3, 4 things which are coming in my mind. And one, of course, is writing about my own village. And there are a lot of characters I have seen for the last, I'm now reaching 70. So you can imagine I have seen their forefathers, and now I have seen their great-grandchildren. So I know each family, and that really attracts me a lot. And yeah, this is one.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much to both of you. I wish we could continue this on, and I know that we will. Thank you so much again to JLF and the whole team, and for putting together this wonderful panel for us to talk about Uday's work and our translation. So thanks very much again, and hope to see you all soon in person, and be well and stay healthy.
Thank you, Robert, Uday, and Jason, for such an interesting conversation. And thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. If you have enjoyed our session, please do share with your friends and family on your social media pages. We promise to be back next week for another interesting session on Jaipur Literature Festival's Words Are Bridges. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.